It crashed for some reason, so sorry about that. Sorry everyone, I have no idea why that crashed. Not a clue. Okay, so I was just showing you why, how many I managed to get out of mine. So I've got my darker tones at the top going down to lighter tones. And we're going to begin today's session, not with a blind contour, but with a single line drawing. So this is one of the ones I did in the botanical kind of theme. And so you can see I've got lighter lines and darker lines. So we're going to do 3 self-portraits with just a line. We're trying to keep this continuous fluid line. And I want to suggest that you do a really light tone, a mid-tone, and then a dark tone for our 3, okay? And you're going to have 2 minutes for each of them. So I'll start with my lightest tone. And I will set the timer. So I've got my mirror set up just behind the phone, which is where I'll be looking. Okay, 2 minutes, off you go. So this doesn't have to be blind. You can look at your drawing as you do it. So I'm going to put my paintbrush to the top of my page. And now I'm following along my hairline and around. And you can move quicker with these than you would with a blind contour drawing. But you still want to keep it as fluid as possible. Now, as soon as the liquid on your brush runs out, you need to reload your brush and then start off again where you left off. So you've had a minute of that. It takes a while to get used to the ink and the paintbrushes, so don't worry if you haven't done too much yet. Okay, 30 seconds left. Just keep reloading your brush as and when you need to. Okay, 20 seconds left. Last 10. And stop. Okay, so you might find, similarly to me, that I started off with a really pale tone, and then actually when I reloaded my brush, it was quite difficult to get it as pale. So mine does actually change how dark my line is, but that's meant to be my lightest tone. So my second one, I'm going to go for a mid-tone. And if you want, you can mix that up in your lid. You might have a palette or a plate that you're using. I usually just use the lid. So I want you to try and forget that first drawing. We're going to do it on top of it, like we did with these botanical ones. We're going to do it on top of it, but try not to just overlay perfectly. I want you to try and forget. It's obviously going to be challenging, but try and forget about that first one, and then you're going to start again. But so that we actually help ourselves forget about that first one, I want you to start at the bottom of your face, so on your neck or a shoulder. Okay, instead of going top to bottom, go bottom to top with your mid-tone. So I'm just mixing it up in there. Okay, I'm setting the timer, 2 minutes, off you go. So for this one, I'm trying to move a little bit quicker because there were lots of bits I missed in the last one because I was a little bit too slow. So if that was the same as you, just try and pick up your pace so that you get more included in this one. Okay, you've had 1 minute. $30 left. Remember to reload your brush. Don't let it get dry. Last 10 seconds. And stop. Okay, fantastic. So that's what I've got to. So they do overlay quite well because they're not blind, so you're able to look as you do it. So you can see that I've got some lighter lines and some darker lines, okay? So for our last 2 minutes, we're going to use the darkest tone possible. So that's hopefully as close to the most concentrated ink as you can manage for our final one. Now, one of the things for this final one I want you to think about is I'm using a medium-sized brush. So it's not really dainty, but it's also not super chunky. But if I press quite hard with my brush, I'll get a thicker line, and then I can get a thinner line if I use just the tip of it like this. So either it's kind of being flattened as I go, or I just use the tip. Okay, so I want you to try and vary how wide your painted line is for this last one using your really concentrated ink. So a few things to think about there. You can start wherever you want for the last 2 minutes. Off you go. And remember, if you just wipe your brush on the side of your cup or on the side of your ink lid, that'll mean that you're not overloading it and kind of saturating your paper. Don't worry about any drips or splodges, that's a really natural part of working with ink. Okay, you've had 1 minute. You just have one final minute on these inky line drawings. Try to make it continuous line, where you're always returning to the place where your ink brush was when you replace it down. And last 30 seconds. Twenty seconds. Last 10 seconds. Okay, and stop. So have a look at your drawing. It's probably not going to look super like you. Maybe it is, and you've done a great job. Mine isn't very similar to me. But you can see that this has been a great warm-up exercise because it's got me thinking more about proportions of my face. Okay, so things like how big my forehead is, how big my cheeks are, how much space there is here between my neck and my top. And some of those things you will have got really accurately. Some of those things you'll feel I was actually quite way off. But this is all about just warming up and a bit of a learning curve for us, okay? So if you can, if you're using a sketchbook, you might just need to leave it open to dry for a little bit while I explain the next thing. If you're using loose paper, I'd suggest putting it to one side and getting a clean bit like this. Okay. I'm going to show you some of the artists that we're going to be looking at today. So, first of all, I've tried to really not delete them this time. Okay. This is an artist that I found on Instagram. Can't actually read the name right now. Hopefully you can. Okay. So this is probably actually printing instead of using just ink with a paintbrush like we are, but there's lots that we can learn from this, okay? So some of the things I think we can take from this is we can think about how much contrast is in this portrait. So if you look down one side of the face, there's some really dark marks. It's like black ink, okay? That hasn't been diluted, hasn't been smudged. It's about as opaque as it could be on that side of the face. And then there are other bits where it's smudged and it's more luminous because the paper underneath is shining through. I think you can only see roughly 3 different tones there. The tone of the paper, a mid-tone, and the black of the ink. Okay, so I think there are only 3 tones roughly in that. And it's quite suggestive. So there's not lots of detail on the face, but you've got these quite almost abstract gestural marks to suggest where shadows are, where the cheek is. So that's our first one that we're going to think about. Now the next one is a Stanley Spencer one. And this one is much more detailed. So this has, I think he might have used a quill for this in points so that it could have been a sharper mark. But with this one, you've got much more detail of even like wrinkles in the skin. And I would say that with this ink one, we can see that there are many more than 3 tones. So if you think back to your tonal trials on the side here, you've got many more of those boxes being used in his example. Okay, the next 2 that I'm going to show you are not in black and white. These are actually wet medium using colour. But I think they're really beautiful for us to consider. So this is a Gonzalez painting. If I just put it like that, it's easier to see. So here, again, not lots and lots of detail used. He's got actually linear qualities to suggest where features are. So he's used lines to suggest where that hat or bandana is. And then you've actually got almost like outlines to certain parts of the face, which is one of the techniques we're going to be using in this next exercise. And then this one's actually my favourite one I've come across in preparing for this session. This is a Frances Hodgkins one. And this is very, very inaccurate in terms of the colours that she's used. But there's something really beautiful about the atmosphere that she's created. And I would say that with this painting, she hasn't actually used the darkest range that she could have done. You can see the skirt and the hat are quite dark, but I think there's still a luminosity from them, okay? So those are the examples that we are thinking about today. I will just show you the black and white ones one more time because that's how we're working. So that was our first one, which is less tonal range, probably just 3, and then the more detailed Stanley Spencer. Brilliant. Okay, how do I get rid of that? Not sure, just leave it like that. Okay. So I'm going to use my pencil and I'm going to, similarly to when we did the botanical class, I'm going to lightly draw my face into these almost zones of tone. So it's almost like I'm creating a map of my face, and where I see dark patches, I'm going to draw shapes to capture those dark spaces and those mid-tones. I want you to think as if you are creating your own paint by numbers of your face. So we'll take 10 minutes to do that in pencil. Okay, so I'm starting the timer for 10 minutes. If you've got long hair, I think sometimes having some of it forward adds, just makes it a little bit more interesting because it can look a bit odd. If you're used to having long hair and it's all behind your shoulder, sometimes it affects the way you look. So I'm not going to press with much pressure with my pencil at all. I'm just going to do a really light, linear portrait. this is the stage that you want to get it as accurate as possible. So if you need to use your pencil, your eraser to rub out, you can do that. Now for this, I'm starting with my hairline and the shape of my face before I'm going in to do anything inside my face, but you could have started with the eyes and worked out. There's no right or wrong. So you've had 2 minutes, you've still got a good long time for this. So you're trying to get it as accurate as possible as a really light pencil drawing. Remember to include those paint by number type shapes on your face. You're not just doing outlines here. You're thinking about where those areas of tone are. You have 6 minutes left. If you need to go back and rub things out so that you're getting it more accurate to your face, it's really worth it at this point doing that. If you've got room for it, try and include your shoulders so that your head's just not just floating on your page. So I'll show you what I've got so far. I wonder if you can see it because of the light, but I've mapped out these zonal areas of tone. That's going to help when I start to bring my ink in. You want to think about that on your hair too. If you see, like, for example, here's darker and the light has caught here, got a darker patch here and here. So try and include those tonal areas as well. And as ever, if you have questions, do feel free to write them into the comment box. You have 5 minutes left, so you're halfway through that linear drawing. 4 minutes left. So at this stage it will probably be looking pretty graphic-y, as if you could find this almost in a graphic novel. But remember, this is almost like just a technique to help us to think about these areas of tone. It's not necessarily going to have the final effect that we want, but this is a stepping stone towards being able to do a portrait without these lines. So it's like a helping hand along the way. Now, if you feel like you're getting to a stage where if you added much more information it would get too complicated, I would suggest that you pause. So for example, for me, I think if I add much more, it will get quite complicated. But you can see here, like even under the neck, I've tried to include tonal areas for shadow. I've split up the hair into these different sections. So for those of you that are working on your linear one, keep going. If you've got to a point where you feel, actually, I'm really happy with that and I think I'm ready for the next stage, I'll explain that to you because you might have worked actually quite quickly. So I'm going to tell you some of the problems that can occur before we start so that you're a little bit aware of what you might encounter. So the first thing when working with wet medium is this problem of bleeding. It's very difficult to add some water without putting ink on it, without that spreading, okay? So you want to try, because we've done this paint by numbers technique, you want to try and apply your ink, or your watery ink, really quite thinly to your page so all those layers are drying very quickly. If you put it on really quite fluidly and it almost pools on your page, it will take a long time to dry and then that ink will bleed into other spaces. So I suggest first tip is to not add too much water, or when you do add the water, to make sure that you're always rubbing your paintbrush along the side so that it doesn't have any drips in it, okay? So this is still very loaded with fluid, but it's not going to be pouring out of my brush when I touch the paper. So that's the first technique. The other is that you can either work in these kind of tonal areas bit by bit, like a paint by numbers, or you could do almost like a mid-tone wash across the whole of it, apart from the really bright highlights. So I'm going to show that as an example on part of it. If you're still doing the linear bit, that's fine, just keep going. So I'm mixing a mid-tone in my cap, and I'm making sure that I'm wiping the edge of it on there. So I'll do it for the hair. I'll make all of the hair this mid-tone grey. And I want to still be able to see my pencil through it, so that's another reason why we don't put too much on at once. Now before it sinks into the paper, you need to move it around quite quickly because it will dry fairly quickly on a warm day like today. So don't worry if it looks a bit patchy, that's kind of the nature of working with ink. For those of you still doing your linear bit, you have got 15 seconds left. Okay, so this will give you an example before you get going. Okay, so forgive me, I'm doing it a little bit haphazardly because I'm trying to show you in good time. So I've applied, even though I had put all those different sections of the hair, I'd split it into tonal shapes like I have here. I've done a mid-tone across it all because all my hair's fairly dark in comparison with my face, so I don't need to leave any white of the page. Even for the highlights will be a mid-tone, whereas the highlights of my face will probably be the white of the paper. Okay, so that means that I can put this mid-tone down my hair. If you've got super blonde hair, you probably can't do that, okay? but for dark hair you can. And then I'm going to mix a darker tone to add in the shadows, for example, those tonal areas. So that's one way of doing it. You do almost like a wash, let it dry, and then build up darker areas. Or you could literally just go in and paint one shape at a time. So that's how I'm going to do it for the next bit. So we're just going to have, it's not very long, we're going to have 7 minutes for this. Off you go. So the challenge is with just 7 minutes is you're going to work pretty quickly. Remember, it's always easier to add ink. It's impossible to take ink away once it's on the page with these permanent types of ink. And this is where your blotting paper will come in handy. If you do put too much ink on your page, you can just blot it back with your kitchen roll. So there's a very quick example of where I've got to so far. So I'm thinking about where those mid-tones are. So this is a darker space, that's a little bit lighter. Keep remembering to rub your paintbrush on the side of your lid. It's very easy when you're working quickly to forget that. I just did just then, and it means you just get so much ink on your page. You've had 2 minutes and you've got 5 minutes left of this. I think this is week 14 of these sessions, so you might feel like, oh, this is looking worse than some of the other weeks. The reason it's probably looking a bit worse is this is a much more complicated technique that we're looking at now. So we've progressed. There have been some simpler sessions, and using ink like this is a more complicated technique. So don't be discouraged. You're actually just playing around with something that requires a little bit more practice. So I'm sure you're more used to working in pencil. Most of us are. You've got 3 minutes left. So I'm trying to do this really quite quickly so I can give you an example. So that's where I've got to so far. So I now need to think about those really dark areas and add in the dark ink. I left the hair for a while. I did that at the beginning so that it would dry before I add in the next bits. 2 minutes left. I'm going to show you what bleeding looks like. This is what I mean when I say bleeding. So I put ink on there and it's spread. Okay, so the different things that you can do if that happens and you're panicking, get your kitchen roll and press it onto your paper to try and lift some of that off. And then I would try, with your paintbrush and a little bit of water, you can try and knock it back. But once it's on it, it can be quite difficult to get rid of that, which might feel frustrating, but I'd say it's one of the kind of joys and frustrations of using ink. It means you can get some quite unexpected results. So try not to worry too much if you've got those spaces that feel, it's not done as I wanted it to do. Last 45 seconds. Okay, and pause where you got to there. So this is where I got to in that time. I don't think it looks very like me, but it has got a range of tones. So you've got some mid-tones, some dark tones. I've probably got about 4 tones in there. So not as many as my first tester kind of line of boxes, but I have got a range. Now, even though that might feel like that took up a huge chunk of time, that was setting us up for our final exercise. So we are going to try to do a self-portrait in ink without using pencil. So I'm going to give you an example of one that I did a while ago. So what you can see here, it is a little bit more abstract in parts because you've just got these quite chunky blocks of tone. But it's possible to create a self-portrait without using those linear shapes to guide us. It's more challenging, but it is possible. So that's our final challenge. If you can, get a blank piece of paper. If you need to turn over in your sketchbook, you can do that. How long do we have for that? So we've got 15 minutes, so it's a good chunk of time. So I will set the timer. When you're ready, if you feel confident, you can head on straight away. But if you're a little bit less confident, I will explain how I kind of achieve that effect without using pencil. So the first thing I do when I'm doing a portrait like that is I will mix quite a light tone. I'm not going to dive straight in with the darkest parts. I use quite a light tone. And then I put in rough planes onto the face. So I'll think about the shape of the hair. And I'm doing it in this light tone because once it's dry, you can always add in more ink to make it darker. But like I said, it's very, very challenging to make it lighter once you put lots of ink down. So using a very light tone, and this is done in oak gall ink, so it's a browny yellowy ink. Using a light tone, that will help you first kind of map out and plan your portrait. So I'll begin with that, and I'll talk you through as I do it. If that completely terrifies you, you can, of course, use a pencil. I'm just trying to set you up to be able to approach ink portraits without using a pencil at all. I'll show you as I'm doing it. It's very, very basic, but I start mapping out, okay, there's these darker shadows down one side of my face. So it's really, really simple. I'm not getting detail in at the beginning. I'm just thinking about the main structures of my face. Don't apply that ink too thickly because you will want to add on top of it once it's dry. Okay, I'll show you how I'm working so far. Still quite simple shapes, no real detail as of yet. If you're at a similar stage and you're now wanting to go back in and add darker tones, but you've got a paper that's just still drenched and wet, what you can do is you can actually work on two at the same time, which I sometimes do. So I'll do that foundational bit, I'll put it to one side, I'll do another one pretty similar. Then while that one's drying, I return to the first one. So it can slow you down working in a wet medium, but it can also mean that you're actually you're working on more than one at once, which you can find at the end. You've got a selection to choose from, which is your most successful. Whereas when you're with pencil, you usually stick with the same one for the whole time, and which obviously has its benefits and its disadvantages. I'm just going to work on the same one for this time so I can see if I can get it fairly completed so I can use it as an example for you. It's quite tempting to leave lots of white on our page, but I would suggest that the white of the paper is just for the very, very bright highlights. For example, that bright highlight, this highlight here. Everything else should be a mid-tone or darker if those are my brightest parts that I'm leaving as the paper. Which you can see with this one that I showed you as an example. There's very little paper left on there apart from the white of the eyes and a tiny bit on the forehead. Everything else has ink on it. If you need more ink in your lid, just put the lid back onto your ink, shake it again, and you can use that ink in the top of your lid. You have 8 minutes left. If you have time today to try a few more of these after the session, I'd really recommend it whilst you're kind of warmed up into using the ink. Try not to leave it a good long time before you do it again, because often I'll find if I do a few in succession within the same day, I'll see drastic improvements over the day. But even if I leave it like a week and I come back to it, often it's almost like my hand and my eye coordination has shifted a bit, and it's like I've forgotten how to do it. So it always takes me, even though I'm well practiced in it, a while to warm back up into using ink into the proportions of the face or the object I'm drawing. Seven minutes left. Show you where I've got to now so you can see it progressing. So slowly I'm getting a bit more detail in, but I'm just working bit by bit, making my ink darker and darker, and slowly building up this 3D object, which is what your face is, just this 3D object in space. So like as if you've got a round tennis ball, the light will hit it in different places. I'm thinking about that to make it feel 3D. Remember what I said about the white paper, so if you've still got lots of white paper, you might just need to do like a mid-tone wash so that you're getting rid of a lot of that white paper. And that will help, even though that feels scary, it will help bring it all together as one object. I'm going to reload my ink lid again. So you can see I do that fairly regularly, probably every 5-10 minutes. I don't have lots on my lid, just a little bit that I can then dilute down. You might find that your paper is wrinkling quite a lot. That's probably because the paper's quite thin. So if you enjoy using ink and you want to work with it a little bit more in the future, I'd suggest investing in some watercolour paper. You can get watercolour paper that has this kind of grain, bumpy grain, or that is smooth press, so it's really flat. I like using both for different things, but for a portrait like this, I'd probably use a smooth paper so it doesn't interrupt the details of the face. Okay, 2 minutes left. I wish I could see all your work right now just to see how it's developing. If you're finding it frustrating, if you're enjoying the process. That's usually something I can tell. If we're all together, I can tell who's getting frustrated, who needs a helping hand. So I do really miss that part of teaching. But hopefully we'll be able to see that one day soon. Final minute. Last 30 seconds. Okay, and stop. So hopefully, even if it's not looking like you, hopefully it is looking like a face. Hopefully. Just opening this up here. In case I lose it. Okay, so let me show you where I got to with it. So it doesn't look loads like me, but you can see that I'm starting to get these spaces that are further back. For example, the shadows here that push back. I think this needs some more work just to get a little bit more of a tonal range. There's a bit of a jump between my light tones and my darkest tones, and we need some more mid-tones for that to feel like it all belongs to one whole. So I'd love you to have a look back at the work you've done today. Just think about the line drawings. Think about the line, like the paint by numbers one, and then this final one. So exercise 1, 2, or 3. And I'd love you to tell me which one you enjoyed the most. It's always really interesting to find out which ones people loved. Last week I found that the majority of people enjoyed the linear one, which surprised them because often people like tonal ones more. But just take a moment to reflect and have a look. It is so hard stopping, is it, when you don't want to stop? You preferred 2, so you prefer it when you have your using your pencil first to just map things out. It definitely It definitely works as more of like a scaffolding system, so you've got something to work with. It can be challenging, that final exercise, just diving in without any landmarks to work with. Anyone else want to share which one they like the most? Exercise 1, the linear one, exercise 2 or exercise 3? Anne-Marie, you enjoyed the third one. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I hope it wasn't, I think you're doing it whilst you're on the train, so I hope that wasn't too messy. Any other preferences, 1, 2 or 3? If you're able to and happy to, I would love it if you sent through a photograph of all 3 of them so we can see a comparison of how you develop through the session. That is our final session on portraiture for the current time. We may do one again in the future, but we'll be on a different theme next week. If you've enjoyed today and you're happy giving, I'll put my donation details onto my story, and it's also on my highlights on my Instagram. Oh great, you went on the train. You really enjoyed the mapping out sections, Simone. Yeah, similar to Tatiana. I think that's often a favourite because it gives you a little bit of a helping hand as you do it. That's it for today. Thank you everyone for joining. Please send me photos. If you want to work on this more in the day or try a few more and send me those photos, you're welcome to do that too. I always love seeing them. I hope you have a wonderful weekend and I will see you next week, hopefully. Bye everyone.